Alright, so today we'll be talking about Context API. Context API, it's a easier way to pass data through the component tree without having to pass props at every single level of your component tree. Alright, so let me present you an example. I already built here an application, a simple application, where you have the landing page, which is with simple data about the user, will be displayed here. In our landing page component, we just display the data. So in order to do this, it's quite easy. We need just to pass some props. So user equals, in our case, I have a stateless component, so I'll use user, which is an object in my case, at the beginning. So type user, and in landing page I'll have user, and then user name, and that did something wrong. Alright, so this is in case we have a direct component on where we want to use the data. It's quite basic, but I'll have the next scenario where we will use the settings component, which has inside the profile page component. Inside the profile page component, we have the profile page user, and inside the profile page user we'll have the same thing rendered. So we have a tree with 3 levels, and we have to pass the data, the same data, but we have to use it in the last component. So let's render the settings page. Alright, we can do the same thing. So we can pass the props down the tree, like usual. So I may go here, user, go to the next one, and in the end, in the last component, we will use that data, username and user.age. So we have the same result, but you can agree that it's not the best way to pass the props, because we have to drill through all these layers and in the end use it in the last component that we need. In order to make this thing easier, we can use the Context API, which will provide a way to use the same data but without passing all these props every single time we need to use any data. Alright, in order to use the context API, we need to, let me just clean everything before. Right, this I don't need. Don't need to pass any props anymore here. Okay. So in order to create the context, I will create a new file. A new file. I'll name it user context provider.js. This can be any name you want, so the name doesn't matter here, but it's alright to have some semantics to when you're in your components. I'll create a function here. Alright, we need one thing in order to create the context, so we have to import React create context. Create context is a method, so we will create a constant named user context, and we'll use that method create context to create our context and store it in the user context variable. All right. Our variable user context will have two parts. We'll have the provider and we'll have the consumer. We'll use the provider to store our data and provide it down the tree, on the component tree. So in order to do that, we'll have to create a new tag, user context, and needs to be in this component because we have to provide data. We'll use that provider. All right. Inside here, the syntax is props.child. I'll explain a bit later what this does. Props here. All right. Now, all right. All right. Thank you. So, we created the return, which will be a provider, but we also have to store the data, which will be global available to all the components. We'll use this user context provider. So in order to do that, I'll go back to my app.js and I will take the state from here and I'll pass it just here. We don't need this data in the app.js. We'll use it in our context. In order to use this hook, we also need to import the use state. All right. So we have the provider. Now we need to use this component to wrap our component, which will be the direct children. So basically, what I'll do, I'll surround the settings page, where later on I will use the data from the context provider within the user context provider component. So alright, I need to import this. User okay, once I wrap this, so now to make this props.children will be replaced by all the childrens I pass within these tags. So my settings page will be the props.children in this case. Okay. After we finish wrapping the components we want to use the data, I will go straight to my last component in the tree, and I will consume the data from the context provider. In order to do that, we need to do one more thing. I will use in the same manner the user.context, the user context that consumer in my profile page user. So I have to export this constant as well. In here I'll import user context from user context. Inside user context dot consumer this time. Now the consumer will receive a method which will render what we need. But how we know how to access the data we want? The callback will receive an argument. You can call it however you want. I'll name it context, and we can do context here. I'll use context as well here. Okay, but we are missing something because we are not specifying the values that we need in order to use it here. So in my context provider, we need to add an attribute to the provider, which is value, and this value can receive a string. For example, let's call it Alex, and if you see now, without passing nothing in my other components like earlier, we can just use that value to display it straight away. Okay, but now how I'm gonna use the actual data I want to use? Beside the string, this value will have to receive an object. So we are not able to use user. This won't be valid. We need to have an object with different methods maybe. So user, which is in our case user. but yeah, makes sense just to keep it simple. And in my context consumer, we'll have context dot user dot user name and context dot user dot age. And now everything works. We just used our data from here without passing props through all the components, and we consume it in the last component we had. It might look more complicated, but you can imagine the usage of the context when, for example, we have more than 5 layers or quite a lot of layers to pass props through, or you need to reuse this global data, because we can consider this as some global data stored in this context. We can reuse it throughout multiple components. So it will be much more easier to use it this way than passing props through all the levels of the component tree. React recommends to use context, not when you have this simple example where you have to pass just to one component, but when you have multiple components where you want to reuse the same data. And also when you have this kind of data, can be actually data like the language the user want to use, the currency, for example, the theme, if he wants a dark theme or a light theme, and you want to reuse that data throughout your entire application. So yeah, this is context. You have any question up to this point? So if we'll decide to have a general, a global data that we need to use through multiple components in different sections, I think this is a good way to use this data without passing through all the components within the section. Yeah. Any questions? Any other question? To get data from the backend. Basically, the context, it's a way to pass data down the components. What kind of data you are using here, it's up to you, because in this function you're able to store whatever data you want. So if you want to fetch from the backend, I think it is possible. All right. So as I told you, this is an object. So for example, you can have multiple keys, multiple values, not just one. So for example, if we want to let's do increase the age, for example, and we want to create a method for that. So we'll have set user, I'll do something like alright, so we have this method, and we can go back in our application, create a button, click, goes H. And now if we use the method, if you can see, we are increasing the age as well. And one more example, you can have multiple elements in here. So for example, we can use the landing page as well here. We need to do exactly the same thing. We need to use the consumer. So have the same procedure, user context dot consumer, have a method inside, I'll just reuse. Oh, in the context callback, you can just have one root element. In my case, I have 3, so it's not alright. I need to have just one. I had I did wrong. What I did wrong? Oh yeah, yeah. Thank you, Dan. All right. So now it works. So if I click this button, can you tell me what's gonna happen? Sorry. Exactly. So we'll change the user age on both of the the pages because we are using the same method in one single place. Yep. So this is all from my side with user context. If you have any question, just let me know. All right. So in order to use the context, first of all, we just need to create a new component where we'll call this React method create context, which will store the in one variable the provider and the consumer. We have in our in the component we just created, we'll store the data we want to use, and as syntax we need to create to return a provider which will wrap later on our components that we want to use the data. So we create the context provider, we set some value, and after that in app or wherever you want to use it, you use the component without the dot. So we use the component we created, user context provider, to wrap the components where we want to use later the data. When you want to consume the data, you just need to import the variable you created, user context, create in the same manner you created the provider, you create user context.consumer. Within the consumer, you must have a callback which will render the data you want to consume. Basically, simple as that. It's a bit confusing, but yeah, it's quite simple. No worries. Anything else? All right, thank you very much. Thank you. All right,